Hello, everybody. Welcome to the office hour in May, and we're very happy to have Travis Campbell to come join us. He is a very well-known expert in Redpanda. He leads a team of experts, and then he is our customer success team engineers, where he does a lot of work with our customers. So he has his first-hand experience with working with Redpanda and a lot of data streaming platforms, and so that's why we have him here. And he recently published a report that covers everything that you need to know about migrating from Kafka to Redpanda. And if you have not check it out, please go ahead. It's actually in our website. I will paste a link in the chat, so you will have access to that, and I'll also include it down in the description below. So I'll without further ado, I'll hand it over to Travis, and yeah, let's get started.
Hey, thanks, Christina. I'm Travis Campbell. I'm on the customer success engineering team here at Redpanda. I've been here a few months now, focused on some of our largest customers who are dealing with kind of like big performance implementations, trying to figure out how to safely move from, Kafka to Redpanda, and just sort of the large scale data challenges that they're contending with. My general background, for if you haven't worked with me before, is I've been working in the data space since about 2010. Primarily doing SRE and DevOps stuff on large scale data analytics platforms, kind of like Hadoop and related things. But my focus now is on data streaming and trying to make data work better for people in general.
That's great. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your latest work on migrations?
Yeah. So when I came to Redpanda, one of the first things that I was tasked with was kind of survey the market and understand how people move from Kafka to like one Kafka platform to another, and kind of come up with a set of best practices and good engineering behavior for those implementations, and pair that up with some of our internal learnings with customers that we've done this work with before, right? Hey, Jenny. And while that's kind of focused on, some of that work has been focused on like moving from like Redpanda V1 in our cloud implementation to V2, like all of the mechanics of moving the data is the same, right? We use Mirror Maker for that. We are Kafka API compatible, so that makes it much easier to do. All the things that you would have to think about when moving from one data platform to another, we make it easier because of all of the compatibility we provide in the tooling. So this culminated in all this research and evaluation and testing kind of culminated in this report that we wrote up, covering not just the technical behavior of the migration, but all the other things surrounding that technical behavior that you need to think about. So it's like, how do you plan for this? How do you look at your Kafka environment and really understand what's going on, so that you can make sure that what you're doing in Kafka, you can also do in Redpanda, right?
So what are the couple of things that you will be looking out for? Like what will you be needing to know in terms of learning how to plan? Like what are the metrics I need to learn? What are the things I need to know before I start planning?
That's a good question. And we actually, in the report, we provide a set of questions to kind of mentally walk through, so that you can identify the important things to pay attention to. So like at a high level, you want to care about like the types of topics you have implemented in your Kafka cluster, right? How many Kafka or Kafka topics you have, sort of the topic configuration with partitioning and so on.
So what kind of different type of topics? Kind of just wanted to know more details about it. Let's just make it casual talk, because I was kind of curious, what type of like topics type do you normally see in customers? Like what are they? Can you categorize them, or are they like all over the place?
I would say that what you're going to often see is you have a high volume topic that is not sensitive to latency, right? Like the message publishing, can be 100 milliseconds, that sort of end-to-end latency. But your volume is in the hundreds of megabytes to gigabytes per second of data flowing through that topic. You kind of have to pay attention to sort of the volume and latency. The other thing we tend to see are low volume topics that are very sensitive to latency. So they may be sub 10 millisecond requirements for getting data through there. And you have to kind of account for this in how you transfer the data between the Kafka cluster and the Redpanda cluster, because that copying process adds its own amount of latency as well, right? So there's kind of these orders of operation you have to think about when doing this data movement.
So when you're sorry.
Yeah,
So when you're prioritizing the migrations, would the type of topics be into consideration? Like, is there any where you want to prioritize this first or that first? For the low volume, high throughput, or the low latency ones, we want to migrate them first, or is there any specific needs that you want people to start first? Would be a best practice.
Yeah. So it's the way I tend to think about the movement of these topics and the movement of the data is to classify them by application, right? It's usually a lot easier to move one application at a time compared to, we're just going to lift and shift a whole cluster at once, right? One of the things you want to think about when doing these sorts of migrations is what is the impact to the upstream and downstream application users, right? So the producers and consumers. When we talk about latency, we kind of have to take that into account because, if you can't take a downtime or a long downtime to do these migrations, you have to build out the migration flow in a way that you can flip the producers or consumers over to the new cluster while maintaining the active flow of your data through that through those two environments, right? So like that's a really big thing to think about on how much downtime are you willing to take or can you take? We have experienced people who are like, yeah, we can stop the data flow for 15 minutes, right? We have people who are like, we can take a downtime for a day, right? So how you decide to do that is really going to depend upon what the requirements of the application are.
Right. So now we know a lot of the application right now, we're doing things in real time, right? So I think the downtime they would be accepting would be a lot lower. So is there anything that we can do that to kind of make it a lot faster to speed up the migration process? I mean, for us, I think it's moving the data, it's planning and then moving the data, right? So I assume a lot of people were afraid of the actual movement of the data because it might take a longer time for copying things. And is there any particular strategy that you're probably going to suggest for that kind of thing?
Yeah. So when on the technical part of this, like there's a couple of phases that you have to go through. There's like the data movement itself. So that's the Mirror Maker 2 part. You have to deal with any potential schema migration as well. There's some things we found with Mirror Maker that make it not ideal in some cases for moving messages around because of the way this Mirror Maker sort of republishes things into sort of the destination topic. So we've kind of built some internal tooling to help make that that part of the process easier. Along with sort of the data, you have all of the supporting infrastructure around that. You have, you know, users and any of your permissions and governance and, you know, anything like that that kind of helps support the application to work. Like, you have to think about moving those things as well, right? So from a process perspective, what we do is kind of set up all of that surrounding infrastructure first. You make sure the users are there, you make sure the permissions are there. We make sure schema migration is you know, kind of working correctly. And you know, we fire up the data copy, right? Once the data copying is running, and the set of data that exists on the source cluster is now copied over to the destination cluster and being updated on a continual basis, then you go look at you know, how do we move the application at that point, right? And I'm going to say it's simple, right? You move the consumers first, so that you have producers producing to the old cluster, you have consumers consuming off of the new cluster, and then you have Mirror Maker keeping data moving between the two, right? And once your consumers are kind of up and running and keeping pace, then you can go flip the producers to the Redpanda cluster, and you know, your migration is effectively completed at that point.
I assume that if this will be easier if you have just few producers and then a lot of consumers, right? But have you ever seen any cases where you have, like, you know, a lot of producers as well, like during that? And does that make the migration process a little bit even longer? What would be the best way of dealing with it? Does all the producers kind of just everybody shuts down and connect it to the new ones, or what is the best way of dealing with that?
Yeah, so this is where it comes down to what is the sort of the use case, right?
Right.
If you have, you know, one large cluster that is dedicated to, you know, one use case, you know, you may have any number of producers, you know, producing into that, you know, small handful of topics.
Can I stop you for a minute? They were saying people are waiting in lobby for community hours, but I don't know. I don't see any people waiting. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah.
So, but in a multi-tenant cluster where you may have, you know, dozens of applications and thousands of topics, you know, that's where it starts to make sense of, you know, migrating, you know, an application at a time, right? You will have some overlapping period where you have both clusters running and doing sort of your production work. It's just a matter of, you know, where are your producers producing to, and where are you consuming from.
I see. And yeah, let me see. So let's talk about the next step. So once after planning, what would be so you mentioned Mirror Makers. Is that the next step of migrating everything, or is there any certain steps that we need to take before we actually do the moving of?
Yeah, so when we talk about the kind of the process of migration, it breaks down into a few phases, right? So there's kind of your investigation phase, where you try to understand what's actually running on your clusters. In many places, the people who use the cluster are not the same people who run the cluster. So the operators, the SREs, the DevOps people, you know, they may be there just to keep the service up and running, right? And they may have, you know, dozens of applications running through that, and not actually know what those applications are doing. So it's helpful for those folks to kind of get an understanding of you know, what's going on there, and, you know, working with their developers and just getting a better sense of what's happening there, right? It's going to help you through this planning process. So once you understand what's happening on the cluster, then you can plan for, like, how do applications need to move, because you may have sort of complex dependencies between applications and their topics, right? You may have one application producing into one topic, a second application reading from that topic, producing to another one, and just having all these intricate dependencies that you have to peel apart to know how and when to move the application. One of the next things you want to do is, so let me take a step back. When we're doing migrations, we often want to have it set up so that you have a development environment and a production environment that you're sort of migrating through, right? So you do all your initial testing and validation and planning based off of that development environment so that you can get everything right and then implement that on production, right? Once you get rid of all of the unknowns, then that makes that production migration safer. Part of that work is the testing, right? Now, with Redpanda being kind of API compatible and a drop-in replacement, we expect that there's going to be minimal to no change in your applications to do the conversion, right? It's Kafka API protocol, it should just work. The things that might change are kind of the things surrounding the cluster and application stuff. So if you're monitoring Kafka in a particular way, you may have to monitor Redpanda slightly differently, right? The metric names may be different between the two that you have to go update. Those aren't necessarily application level changes in my view. Those are just supporting infrastructure that may require things. But you want to do sort of the kind of the testing of what happens when you make the flip from your producers and consumers working with Kafka to your producers and consumers working with Redpanda. We say it's compatible. We do our very best to make sure it's as compatible as possible. You may be doing something we don't expect, testing is how you sort of catch that stuff. So you would still want to do sort of your own end-to-end application testing just to verify that things are going okay. And then you sort of get into like the full-on migration and cutover and any sort of post-migration tuning that may need to occur.
Now I can. So let's continue on. So thanks for that. So where were we? Sorry.
We were talking about sort of the kind of what happens after, or what additional things should be done in the migration. So yeah, it comes down to making sure, like, once you've done the planning and sort of understanding what's happening with your cluster, you got to think about the testing phase, right? Like making sure your application works the way you expect on Redpanda, because like I said, we are API compatible. And we do our very best to ensure that. You could be doing something we don't expect, right? And just being able to flag that is something you'll want to pay attention to.
Right. So for the people that first joined this session, so we were just going over some of the things that Travis has a report on. So he has written a report on migration, which covers a lot of things that you know before you migrate the system. So that was just what we were going through, and we just went over the planning phase, which was some of the topics or some of the things for. Travis, since a lot of people that just joined, do you want to quickly cover that? Kind of just give us an overview. I'm sorry about this glitch. I have no idea what's going on, so sorry about this. We'll make sure what happened this next time.
So just if you can see it, I dropped a link into this report that we spent the last quarter writing up. It's basically a technical and business process for how to migrate from Kafka platforms to Redpanda. So it's a lot of planning guidance. It's understanding what things you should think about, how to identify things within your cluster that do or do not need to migrate. That guidance around the using Mirror Maker for doing this. Common issues that we've seen with Mirror Maker in our own migrations with our own customers. So it's a kind of an end-to-end report on sort of what to expect when you're expecting a migration. So it's pretty in depth to try to help people who may not have done this before to understand and think about what's involved in this process, right? In any migration, if you've never done this before, it may look like there's a lot of unknowns and it may look like a scary process. And the goal of this is to help define what this stuff looks like, make it not scary, and make it straightforward and feel safe and be safe. And that's sort of the goal of this entire document.
Yeah, and I just want to take this chance to encourage everybody in the room to kind of, if you have any questions, just shout it out. This is a community event, so we want to hear your voice. We want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear your questions. So feel free to just shout out your questions. So yeah, so are you currently working on a migration case, or are you currently just kind of looking into, what is going on with, like, is it difficult to move from Kafka to Redpanda? Is that something that you're looking for? Kind of just let us know what you are right now. That would be great. Yeah, so, but I think for what I've just talked to Travis is that there's a lot of nuance that you have to take a look when you're migrating from one place to the other. And yeah, so please continue, Travis. So we've covered the planning and the types of topics. We kind of went over a little bit about what things need to consider, like the testing phases. Anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. But should we move on to the next part where we start the actual moving of the data?
Yeah. So with Mirror Maker 2, kind of general guidelines around this is you can use Mirror Maker 2 from upstream Kafka. You can just run that. It's a Java program. We provide a container that has Mirror Maker in it as well. It's what we use in our public cloud implementation, and you can run that container yourself if you want to. It hooks into Redpanda console, so you can sort of manage it that way if you want. There's a couple connectors within Mirror Maker 2 for making all this work. So there's I apologize, the names are escaping me right now, but it's in the report. There's 3 connectors that you set up. One is basically for dealing with moving the data itself. One is for doing offset translation, and one is for heart beating, so you can kind of keep track of the data movement itself.
What are each one used for? Can you explain a little bit about each connectors, kind of what they are for?
Yeah. So the kind of the important one is the offset translation, right? The way Kafka works is when you publish a message into the topic, it kind of gets this offset to tell the consumer roughly where that message is in the topic. When you publish messages across clusters, they will get different offsets based off of kind of, for simplicity's sake, kind of like the time of where they get published into the topic. When you're copying data between these 2 topics with Mirror Maker, what it's actually doing is it's consuming off of one topic and publishing into, so it's consuming off the source topic and publishing into the destination topic. When that happens, it would create its own new offset in that destination. So on the Redpanda side, and that's not specific to Redpanda. That's just how Mirror Maker works in general for any Kafka setup. So one of the things you want to look at doing, especially for managing your consumers better, is enabling this offset translation so that when you move consumers to the Redpanda side, they are able to pick up from where they left off when you move them, right? So it's pretty critical to make sure that that offset translation is happening.
Is that going to add more overhead to the actual movement of the data, or is it just like another set of extra process that needs to be done?
It's fairly lightweight, and it's something that you would do in conjunction with the um, uh, and I'm totally blanking on the word right now, on the connector that actually moves the data, right? So you would do those two in almost every case.
Okay.
And then the sort of, like I said, the heartbeat connector, basically what that does is it causes like a message to get written on the source side that gets copied over at roughly the same time and rate as all of your other topics, so that you know that like the copy process doesn't get hung up somewhere. It's kind of an indirect way to evaluate the lag between the two clusters.
So when we're doing migration, say we have for a system, because we want to move a set of producers and consumers move over on the same time because they all belong to the same application. Sometimes I would have multiple topics that I need to move at the same time, right? So does that mean that I have to create, is it better if I create multiple mirror makers to do the copying, or should I just kind of enable the parallelism to make it faster? Kind of like, what is the strategy and how do we decide on which to do what?
Right. A lot of it is going to depend upon the volume of messages coming into the source topics, right? By default, you can have Mirror Maker, copy every topic in the source cluster, and more specifically, it's copying the sort of the external topics, not the internal ones like the schema or the all the other internal topics that can get created in a Kafka environment. So like the volume is going to matter here. The Mirror Maker itself has the ability to kind of parallelize its copies, and you can tune that up or down based off of how many topics you have, how many partitions. There is a little bit of calculation you need to do ahead of time to kind of figure out what that optimal number is. I mentioned it in the report. It's something like one task per minimum of one task per partition, and then as you get to a certain number, you sort of start thinking about it in terms of like some number of partitions per task, right? So it's basically copying data from partition to partition is essentially what it's doing. So yeah, there is a mechanism to parallelize that. In the case where you have maybe a couple high volume topics where they're producing hundreds of megabytes or gigabytes a second, you may want to have dedicated mirror makers for that, just to make sure that those are isolated from the lower volume topics or lower latency topics. So it just depends on what your expectation is for throughput and latency and stuff like that.
Sounds good. Anybody has any questions or no? Cool. Perfect. So yeah, I'm just curious. Have you worked on any customer recently that's doing migrations, and what is your experience with that, and how were they doing their migrations, and what's their plan? How did they do that?
Yeah, so we worked on one recently with a customer who, I'm trying to remember. They said they had one set of topics. So when you normally, I'll put that in air quotes, when you normally build topics, right? You have a schema ID associated with the topic, right? Mirror Maker handles that just fine, right? So it can copy the basically the schema over, and the messages just work. In this particular case, they were embedding the schema ID into the message itself. So there's a way you can do this with Kafka to say each message has its own schema ID, reference to some version of a schema, or basically what they were doing is that they were having multiple schema types inside a single topic, because they were sharing the topic across multiple applications, right? We can debate whether or not that's a good design or not.
I question that, because why would you do that? Because you're
I think
the same topic.
Yeah, I think in their case they were evolving the use of the topic across multiple applications. So, people do things in production because it makes sense to them at the time, and then later they run into reasons why you don't do that. Okay. In their case, what was happening was they would use Mirror Maker to copy this particular topic over, and anytime the message was produced, the schema would a schema ID would get generated in Redpanda's schema registry, but it would not be the same schema ID as what was in the message itself. So when they would go to read that message, it would never be able to resolve a schema because the schema IDs were just different. We've actually built some stuff in internally to help make that part of the process easier. In their case, what they ended up doing, because we just didn't have this tooling at the time, they used an open source tool to basically read the messages from the source cluster and republish with new embedded IDs that would match the schemas on the Redpanda side. So that's one way they worked around it.
I see. So it's like an extra step where they kind of do the mapping themselves.
Right.
Okay, I see. Is that the only challenges that you face when you move the data, or is that are there any things that they had to go through when they're doing migrations, or everything was just kind of smooth and sail? You got your things copied over and you suddenly have your things running on Redpanda right away?
We've actually run into a number of issues around things like TLS validation, making sure that TLS configurations are correct on the source and destination clusters for Mirror. A lot of it is the standard operational issues rather than, hey, there's something weird and broken with a message, like this thing where the message, the schema IDs were different. That's probably the oddest thing we've experienced so far. Most other things are related to configuration issues of Mirror Maker itself.
Right, I see. So speaking of TLS, I'm thinking around the where the securities are coming from. Like, how do you deal with moving the ACLs? How do you deal with the log, the sign-ons for applications? Do you move them right away? Do you just let them keep as it is from the Kafka side, or do you kind of just create everything new there, like from your perspective, like?
Yeah, there's not really any. So even in the Kafka world, I don't believe there's any real tooling to make this easy, right? So what you end up having to do is, getting lists of your users on the source cluster and go creating those on the destination cluster, getting all of the ACLs for those users and pre-populating them on the destination cluster.
I guess that's just one of the things that you have to do, and just do it once and it should be fine, right?
Right.
So one question from Ted: how does Redpanda use Cert Manager? Can it be disabled if we want to generate our own certificate externally?
Yes, you can use your own supplied TLS certificates for sure. We have customers who do that. I think with Cert Manager, we primarily use it in our Kubernetes environments. But I believe you can override that within your help charts and such. I don't know that I've seen it a lot in use with the people who deploy directly on an operating system, so running under systemd. Primarily what we see there is they'll build out their own certificate authority and do sort of self-signed certificates at that point, or they grab certificates from something like Microsoft Exchange, or not Exchange, Active Directory.
Thanks. So for context, we're looking at either doing the bring your own cloud option or the Helm chart deployments for Redpanda. So if we were to use our own certificates, I imagine that it's just a secret object that we would tell Redpanda to use.
I'd have to go look that up. I don't remember. Happy to follow up with you after this for sure on that. If you want to let Christina know how to get a hold of you, we can figure that out.
Sure, thanks.
All right, so that kind of, I think Ted, you bring up a really good questions about, would it be different if we're migrating to a local cluster or to a BYOC cluster? Would that be a difference in terms of planning and in terms of way of doing migrations?
Not really. I think the differences are mostly around like how you manage things like adding ACLs and adding users and stuff like that. If you're dealing with, fundamentally, you're moving a topic, right? You're moving the data with the topic and sort of the things around that topic that's supported. So ACLs, users. I can't think of anything else that would be there. So you would still use MirrorMaker in that regard. I think setup is probably going to be easier in the case of moving to BYOC or dedicated, because we provide MirrorMaker in the Redpanda connectors already, so you wouldn't have to run it yourself. Trying to think if there's anything else. Configuration would be through the user, the control pane. You wouldn't have to mess with the MirrorMaker config file. You could use MirrorMaker directly if you wanted to at that point, but again, at that point you're doing some of the configuration management yourself. So I would say moving to cloud would probably be easier than on self-managed.
All right. Okay. I think we're almost at time, but we're happy to stay a little bit longer since we started a little bit later. Do you have any questions, any more questions that you want to ask? Or I can quickly sum up what we've covered this time.
One thing I do want to point out is when we talk about this stuff, we talk about moving from Kafka, right? So it's not necessarily, it has to be Apache Kafka. It could be AWS's flavor of Kafka with MSK. It could be Confluent, right? Fundamentally, all of those things are essentially the same. They're basically running all Apache Kafka under the hood. There may be some localized things that they do to deal with how they run in those platforms. But as long as we have access to a Kafka API port and MirrorMaker, we can pull data off of those clusters.
All right, so I think I want to ask one last question. So I have to ask this question. So when you see the customer, they were migrating from Kafka to Redpanda, did you see a significantly lower usage of hardware compared to what they used to have?
Yeah. So
I had that question.
And I'm not trying to be flippant here, right? It's more of it's a surprising amount of reduction. I think is how I would frame it. I have one very large customer who is migrating, or actually has migrated some of their workflows, and they've seen like a 60% reduction in infrastructure going to Redpanda for the same level of throughput.
Oh wow. Okay, that was not expected, but that's great numbers. Perfect.
Yeah. And again, it's going to depend on what your use case is and how you're doing things. We have seen higher levels of reduction, but I would say, you're probably looking in the 50% range reduction at least. Again, it just depends on what you're doing.
All right, so yes, so Ted has another question specifically for BYOC. The brokers and the TOS config lives in the cluster, and the control plane exists in the cloud. Is that the correct summary? So replication would be internal.
So if your Kafka cluster lives in, okay, so BYOC would live in a VPC that you control. So like the cluster side of things would live there. You would have Kafka in, I assume, another VPC internal to your enterprise, your company, wherever that cloud is. MirrorMaker 2 would only be talking between those two clusters in that VPC. So you'd have to make sure that the VPC where Kafka is could talk to the VPC where Redpanda is, and be able to talk to our advertised Kafka ports. But yeah, it shouldn't be crossing anything like over the internet. That said, if you were using Redpanda dedicated and not using VPC peering, then you would be going over the internet, right? Because in dedicated, the way we expose the Kafka ports by default is, it's a public IP, it's a Kafka port, it's behind authorization and authentication and encryption, TLS, right? So like there's levels of protection there, but there's still that's just how the path would work in that case. But for BYOC specifically, it should just be direct between the two clusters.
So is it fair to say that the control plane actually doesn't really do anything? It basically is just a command center that gives control to the actual broker that's running in your own cloud. So you're basically having to migrate to each other. You're just having two data transmit between each clusters, right? That's kind of what's going on.
Right. So in BYOC, we have like this agent that would run associated with your cluster, and that agent kind of calls out to our control plane for kind of commands on what to do. The connector and Redpanda itself would live within the BYOC environment and would be sort of interacted with at that level.
All right. I think in that case, do we have any more questions, or if you want to discuss anything with Travis? I think this is your only chance. Otherwise, he will not always be online and answer your questions. Anybody?
Just to point out, I am on the Redpanda community Slack.
Yes.
So if you have questions there, feel free to ask in the Redpanda channel, general channel. I try to pay attention to that as part of our normal, day-to-day work on the customer success team, just to kind of help people through the process of using Redpanda, whether or not they're a customer. So.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you, Travis, for coming to the office hours. Thank you all.
Yeah, have a good day.
Bye.